You're very welcome to this discussion on how we remember war as part of Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival 2020, hosted by Smashing Times International Centre for the Arts and Equality. And I will be your moderator for this evening. My name is Maureen Hetherington, and I am the CEO of The Junction, and that's a community relations and peace building initiative. And one of our areas of work is focused on the decade of centenaries, 1912 to 1922. But I'm also the founder of Towards Understanding and Healing, and that is a project that deals with the past through storytelling and positive encounter dialogue. So I'm very interested and looking forward to this event and hearing from our speakers. So before we start, the format for the format is input from each of our speakers, and then there will be a 15-minute question and answer and hopefully a conversation afterwards about the work. So first of all, let me now introduce our speakers for this evening. We have Elaine Ford, who is the Head of Engagement for the Playhouse in Derry, Londonderry. We have Fergus Cooper, documentary filmmaker, John Reevy, filmmaker, Paul Reevy, actor and writer, Frederic Lecomte, founder and main facilitator of the Theatre and Reconciliation Method, and Fiona Bawn Thompson, actor, writer, director, and choreographer. So, thank you all, and we'll proceed. So Elaine is going to speak first on her work at the Derry Playhouse and how they deal with conflict through the arts. So over to you, Elaine.
Ciara, Kevin, and everyone at the festival for inviting me this evening. I'm very happy to be here. As Maureen mentioned, I work at the Playhouse, which is an award-winning arts centre based in the heart of Derry, Londonderry, founded in 1992 at the height of the Northern Ireland conflict. Our mission is to deliver innovative, accessible arts, education and peace-building programmes that enrich the lives of the people we serve. Much of our work addresses the legacy of the Troubles through people's lived experiences. And just to remind you that over 30 years, the Troubles in Northern Ireland had a huge human cost. 3,500 people were killed and approximately 35,000 people were wounded. The legacy of the conflict is still visible in Northern Ireland through sectarianism, poor mental health, policing issues, segregated housing and education, lack of equality and economic instability. I've worked at the Playhouse since 2004, and through our work, I've seen how the arts have enabled people to change their attitudes and perceptions towards one another. I've seen how ex-combatants and victims have become friends. I've seen young people develop confidence in the police. I've witnessed how theatre, storytelling, and art have enabled people and communities to understand, reconcile, build peace, humanise one another, and to seek change. In 2009 to 2013, American theatre practitioner Taya Sepanik was artist in resident at the Playhouse. Her methodology, Theatre of Witness, created a safe space for people from opposing backgrounds and views to engage with one another through theatre. Taya created productions which brought ex-combatants of the IRA and the UVF together alongside police officers and victims to share their lived experience in a safe space. They created theatre productions sharing their own testimony. Their honesty, their courage, and their experiences resonated with and moved audiences, which encouraged healing and understanding. Over the past 3 years, I've produced 4 productions which are part of our Theatre and Peacebuilding Academy. Similar to Theatre of Witness, the productions have reached into the pain, hurt, and division, as well as the courage and resilience of those individuals who were impacted by the Troubles. The first production we created, The Crack in Everything, developed by Irish playwright and director Joe Egan, explored the lives of 6 innocent children who were killed during the Troubles between 1971 and 1981. Their families simply wanted to participate in this production to remember the children. The next production, Blood Red Lines, developed by Robert Ray, shared the stories of 11 people living on the border whose lives changed forever as a result of the Troubles, and fellow panellist Paul Reevey was in Blood Red Lines and will share his experience with us shortly. Most recently, writer and poet Damien Gorman created Anything Can Happen, which explored the lives of 6 courageous and resilient people who lived through 1972, the worst year of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. 2 of the 6 community cast lost their brothers. Richard lost his sight, Hazel lost her husband, and others lost their youth. The production enabled them to recognise, process, and share their pain and their healing. I want to end by showing you a short trailer of the 4th production we created called First Response, a production devised by Japanese-American artist Eileen Conant. In this production, 8 frontline workers share the impact of responding to incidences, including Oma Bomb, Bloody Friday, Bloody Sunday, and many other horrendous atrocities during the Northern Ireland conflict, and Kevin's going to kindly show the film.
Nobody has grieved in this province yet. Nobody can accept anything because they haven't grieved. We're still in shock.
We were dealing with bomb explosions, dealing with a lot of incendiary attacks, and that was mixed in amongst all of the routine, if you can call it that.
When people say that it was a dirty war, by God, it was a dirty war. I just knew that it was my time to tell my story.
We had removed casualties who are still living, and we were gone. You never actually saw a paramedic or an ambulance man being interviewed.
Many of my contemporary colleagues were taken before their time through a variety of things, from depression to PTSD to cancer, and there aren't that many of us left.
Northern Ireland has one of the highest rates of suicide among young men. A lot of that comes from what happened in the past, and looking at the past and what we can learn from it, and then bringing that into today.
Are these yours? Some of them?
What's inside them?
Not sure how to explain.
Can we open them?
It's probably best to leave it.
Why? I want to see what's inside.
Wait, what's in that one?
I was talking to my sister earlier on, and it was almost like for years you lived with like a box under the bed with like dirty washing in it. Every now and again you sort of make the bed and it peeks out from under the bed and you kick it back in again because it's not something you want to think about or talk about. And this is almost like opening a box and taking it and shaking it out and even talking it through and talking to other people about it. I've just found that really, really very positive and therapeutic in a very practical sense.
We didn't get counselling and therefore you had to put the individual trauma parts into boxes in your head. Anytime I was interviewed on the television about my stories, I kept saying that. And I hope that I gave her the idea, but maybe she had it in the first place.
In order to create a narrative that has meaning, I needed to do something poetic or transposed or non-literal in order to kind of bring 7 people together into one story. I'm sitting there going, who's the protagonist? Well, clearly the ensemble. Then who's the antagonist? Their memories?
We're in a way revealing the people, persons, individuals, and listening to what the drama students are telling us. We were doing the crying in December, angry with each other, storming out, and they started crying just 1 week ago, the young people. And that was because they suddenly began thinking, what were their parents doing at that time?
Our family, we never really talk about it. It's something that I never really even thought about. In the early rehearsals, it was almost like a big blur. And you were just like, wow, I don't know what to say. But over time, you start to learn, about the past, what it was actually like. And it's also like reflects on the society that we live in.
When we told them our stories, they'd never heard of them before. I feel that their generation needs to hear our stories so that they will never get involved in anything like that again.
It moved from the young people being some sort of sounding board for us to bounce stories off to an actual real conversation starting, for them to start to open up and share their experiences about the difficulties that young people are facing today.
A lot of the first responders have mental health issues because of the troubles. They have PTSD and depression and flashbacks. We don't have that, but we still have anxiety and mental health issues. And I think a lot of young people are still anxious about Protestants and Catholics and the divide between that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elaine. Such a powerful start. Thank you for sharing, and we'll hear from you later on about some of your work. So thank you. Now we're going to move on and hear from Fergus Cooper, who will speak about a humanitarian and media professional's reflections on the challenges of truth recovery, reconciliation, and working with victims and survivors of war. He will also speak about his film, A Quiet Shuffling of Fate. So over to you, Fergus.
Thank you. Can we just show the trailer?
And the thing that struck me was how much dust there was, both over people as they walked in or were carried in through the casualty department, and also on the floor and in the air. There seemed to be dust everywhere. Northern Ireland has the highest proportion of the population suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is compared to places like Lebanon, like South Africa. We tried to carry on as normal. There was a process of normalisation which we as individuals were living out in our own lives, but it was almost government policy. The organisation and arrangement for delivery of services were as though we lived in Hampshire, for example. For something that has had such a major impact on a population, it is almost beyond understanding that this would not be brought in centrally to the peace process. Terrible events do terrible things inside your head. The danger is that victims of the violence whose needs are not adequately understood and identified and responded to run the risk of becoming victims of the peace. And it is late in the day, but not too late.
Thank you to the Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival for inviting me to participate on the panel. Just to begin by telling you a wee bit about the film and how it came to be made. The film took about 2 years from start to finish. I interviewed David Bolton for maybe about 3 or 4 times, and I then spent about 9 months doing much more detailed research and talking to people working directly with victims and survivors. The film was shot over 10 days in 3 seasons of the year: summer, autumn and winter, and mainly on locations in Fermanagh, Tyrone and Belfast. The film explores conflict trauma and the recovery journey through the eyes of just one individual, David Bolton, who led the post-trauma recovery response to both the Enniskillen and the Omagh bombings, events that took the lives of 42 people and over 600 people were maimed. In the course of the film, we learned that David himself experienced trauma very early in his childhood. His adult and professional life was the search for answers to how one lives with and recovers from trauma. In 2001, he established the Northern Ireland Centre for Trauma and Transformation. His research, along with that of the University of Ulster in Jordanstown, established that over 43,000 people in Northern Ireland live with post-traumatic stress disorder, and over 200,000 people have conflict-related mental health conditions. My motivation in making the film was concern in the drift in our politics and in the peace process that was visible from about 2010 onwards. The rising violence, the failure of governments across the islands to adequately meet the needs of victims and survivors. I wanted to help ordinary people to understand the impact of conflict trauma on individuals and across the generations, and the human cost of failing to deal with it. I'm the former head of country of Save the Children in Northern Ireland. I'm all too familiar with the impact of conflict trauma on young lives. I was the media spokesperson for Save the Children's international campaigns on Syrian refugees, and I supported the Dubs amendment that led the government to commit to resettle 3,500 Syrian families in the UK. Indeed, I had a very humbling experience recently at the latest screening of The Quiet Shuffling of Feet during Good Relations Week. 4 Syrian refugees viewed the film online and engaged in a question and answer session afterwards. What do we know about war? At the beginning of the 20th century, at the time of the First War, the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars, 80% of the casualties were soldiers and 20% were civilians. Now, in the 21st century, in the era of the smart bomb, the laser-guided missile, the remote-controlled drone, over 80% of casualties are civilians. Iraq, Syria, the Yemen, Palestine, just some of the countries in which such lethal weapons are regularly deployed against unarmed civilian populations. We live in an era when combatants control much of our access to the media, our access to the war zone, presenting unique challenges in reporting the true nature of conflict. Journalists themselves are frequently targeted by combatants. We have invented a whole new lexicography to minimize emotional responses to the horrors of war. Civilian casualties are dehumanized and referred simply as collateral damage. The old model of war that had nation states facing off with standing armies and uniformed soldiers no longer pertains. The wars we fight now are interventions, counterinsurgencies, fights against global terrorism, police actions, and proxy wars. We have defense forces and defense weapons that disguise and mitigate the lethal nature of their armory. From a humanitarian perspective, we know that the victims of war are not just those who are killed and injured, but the many civilians who flee war zones. When you put children and old people on the road, they die in vast numbers from exhaustion, dehydration, and disease. Refugee camps are meant to be temporary, before people are either returned home when peace is restored, or given sanctuary and protection and residency in a third country. Refugees are no longer welcome in Europe. The challenge for me as a filmmaker is, how do I tell their story without exposing them to further harm and trauma? How do I humanize the plight of victims and survivors so that we can respond emotionally, one human being to another, rather than averting our eyes and absolving ourselves of all responsibility? When we remember war, we need to remember the victims and survivors of the war, not just the combatants. To ensure a peaceful future, we must first reconcile ourselves with our painful history. If we don't, then we will live with a culture of conflict that all too quickly can erupt once more into cycles of violence. That has been our experience in Ireland. Truth recovery is an important tool in peace building and reconciliation. As a documentary filmmaker, I believe in truth recovery and healing through remembering. Thank you.
Fergus, thank you so much for that, and hopefully we'll be able to revisit some of that at the end. Thank you. The person up next is John Reevy, and he'll speak next about his film, Reevy Brothers, which tells the story of the death of his three uncles, the three Reevy brothers killed in 1976 in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Over to you, John.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. It's a massive honour and privilege to be speaking on a panel with all these talented people, so it means a lot, and especially for tuning in. So I'm going to talk a bit about Reevy Brothers, the film which we finished up shooting there last month, I believe, which was a long process. It began being written last year, so it was about a year in production before we actually got the piece shot. Just a short film. There's my earphone going off. Just a short film of 15 minutes, which was always going to be a bit of a challenge, especially when the story is so massive and you're talking about something to do with war. So I'll tell you a bit about the project first. Me coming from a younger generation, let's say, I wasn't around for the Troubles. I wasn't around for things that happened at that time, and I completely had to go off my own research, how people spoke about the boys, what people said about them, and it was all to do with how I adapted that and how I was going to create my own world with this information that I was given, because of course when you're not there you're going to have to make it up yourself, if that makes sense. So that was the kind of approach I wanted to take. I wanted to place myself in the situation whenever I close my eyes and dream at night of what the boys would have went through. I really tried to create this world where they would have been living in, and what my understanding of it is after hearing the stories from my father, from my uncles, from people who were around to live and tell the tale. So that was the kind of approach I took in order to tell the story. There's plenty of behind the scenes photos which will probably pop up on screen at some stage, and I can talk to you a bit about those. But the way it's going to work is after that, I, relying on the research, what I did was I interviewed people that were around at the time. So the three Reevy brothers, there were a massive family. So I went and interviewed every single one that I could and got their time of day to see what they thought of the boys, how they thought, what they were thinking, and what they would have acted like. Because there's some, when you're in a family, some people will speak about you differently than others. So it was important I got as much research as possible, as many opinions of the boys as possible, so that I could merge all these different opinions together and create the characters that were the boys in the end. So that was kind of how I approached the character design, and it was a super fun process, but also really, really deep. So, for example, after interviewing the family, one of the boys was engaged at the time. And we actually went and spoke to the woman he was engaged with now, called Alice, and she's fabulous. And it's turned out now, she's married now with children and an amazing husband, and she's loving her life. But the way she spoke about one of the Reevy brothers was it was honestly one of the craziest experiences of my life. Just hearing how well she spoke about Brian, how close she was with Brian Reevy, how she had a connection with Brian Reevy, and I think having that kind of opinion as opposed to someone in the family really let me know what kind of person Brian was, and that I could make his character as believable as possible for the Reevy Brothers film. So, writing the story, I decided to focus on Anthony, as he was the one who survived the shooting. Bit of an interesting one, because once he survived, he was able to tell the tale. He was able to, really recall what happened, who died first, that kind of thing. So I had the most information from him, and I wanted to tell the story from his perspective, so the audience only hear what he hears, see what he sees, know what he knows. So that was very interesting, taking it from his point of view. On the screen now, you'll see some behind the scenes. I'll just pop up. So this is like me working with the cast and crew, and obviously trying to get some old vintage vehicles in to try and make it look as close to time as possible, which was a lot of fun. So when I was approaching the story, I had to make sure it was unbiased, because I find with telling war stories now, specifically about the Troubles, is that a lot of people will think you're trying to bring up bad blood, or you're trying to bring up some kind of bad message. And that was never the case with this piece. With this piece, I wanted to retell what happened, but in no way, shape, or form bring up any kind of bad blood. A completely new way of approach, because of course I'm part of a generation which are now coming up and trying to not act in the ways that people did back then. But at the same time, I think it is worth remembering and educating the people that this is what happened back then, and it's very important that stories like this are told, so that we'll never forget these kind of things happened, and that's how we became the people we are today. So I suppose that's kind of how I went about approaching the whole scenario, and just talking through these couple behind the scenes. I mean, it was a crazy 4 days shoot, so it was, and we're currently in the editing process. So we're looking to release the piece around the beginning of next year. Would be absolutely fantastic, but you know what it's like, the editing process. People say it could be done when you never know the case. So that's a bit from me about the piece, how I came to writing about it, and how someone my age, 22 years old, who wasn't around for any kind of shenanigans that did happen, really, really tried my best to tell the story as fairly and as close to the tale as possible. So yeah, thanks a million.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit more from you as well afterwards. You might be very young, but you sound very mature. And I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about your process in doing that. So we'll move on. So next we'll hear from Paul. And Elaine mentioned Paul earlier on, and he's going to speak a little bit about the theatre production Blood Red Lines. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much. As you may or may not know, that was my son who was the last speaker, and as I put my thoughts and words onto the stage, John has put his into film, but stage is where I am, and that is my life. So where are we here now? How we remember war? Well, I remember war because those were my three brothers that John has made the film about, and it brings it home to me. So, but when I got my chance to be in Blood Red Lines, this is where I wanted to be. I knew I could act. I'm an actor by trade, and I can do that on the stage, and I had to give something back. Now it was my turn. So you see, when I was young, most of the war was in Derry. Where I lived away in South Armagh, there was very little talk of people getting killed or anything. It was just something that happened far away. But then in 1976, it came to my house, the war. 3 of my brothers were shot dead by the notorious Flannan gang. And then in 2000, I got a chance in Blood Red Lines, wider audience. Our story told by acting in words, and to warn people that war is a horrible thing. I remember the rehearsals as if the cast were in an army going to war. Most of the time was spent talking and meeting with the director. I suppose he was a general, we'll say. And writing the script, I suppose, was like looking at the maps of the field. This is the road we were going. Then was the exercises, breathing and vocal. I suppose this was the drill then. And Kieran Smith was a drill sergeant who put us through all this torture every weekend. I'll never forget it. But it was all good fun in doing so. But out of war was a different thing on the stage. The stage was our battlefield, and our words and music were to be our armoury. This is the way we approached this instead of guns and bullets. I had grave reservations, really, about telling my story. Why? Because it was mine and it was my comfort blanket. It was for many years. I knew nothing about war. All I wanted was peace. Peace in my own head. But I had demons for a long time. And now I had to change it with blood-led lines. This is us on stage here, just doing some bit of acting. As you can see there, that's me standing there with a green shirt on me, delivering, I'm sure, something lies, I presume. That's I think a final, but maybe the final night there in Uri or somewhere like that, I think. But yeah, there was 11 people all together, and most of them had all their stories. People from along the border, Dublin and Monaghan, Bobbins, there's which was really great to have them on board because they had some very, very individual stories to tell and some great singing voices as well. And it really was 11 people come together as strangers and left us best friends in the world, I'd say. I'll never forget those people because they really were special to me. You know, some of them cast there had some of the horror stories they had were worse than what I had to tell. They really were gut-wrenching, to say the least. People blew up, burned, shot, tortured. Oh, it was really the stuff of nightmares. We even had a British soldier in it, this fella here on the right-hand side. He was there to tell his story as well. An ex-combatant, I suppose, in the war. It really, it took me a long time to get to know him and to really appreciate who he was and where he was coming from. And, you know, me and him as friends now and keep in contact by phone, email and different things, you know. And it's those types of things that brings us out of the war and brings us back from the cold into the heat. And these are things that can't be replaced anywhere. You can't buy these in the shop. These aren't for sale. But anyhow, I wasn't afraid of the stage as I was acting for over 20 years. But this was a different thing to be doing for me. And as we began to recount our stories, I could see that the cast and the audience were gripped with fear. We sang a song which was said, and I'll just sing you a line of it here. And it went like this. If you had seen what I had seen, if you had seen what I had seen, if you had seen what I had seen, you'd never go to war. You know, I thought that was a very powerful thing. And that was from Tommy Sands was the musical director. He done a magnificent job in all the songs that he done. And I must say, the director in this case here, he said that we weren't actors, but we were witnesses to history. And really, that is right, you know, and that's the way I remember it. We were there to well, I suppose, educate and demonstrate and try to keep people, educate them on what happened in our lives. And surely nobody else would like to go back to that. And that was the theme of the songs and different things in that way. And we took the show to Newry, Belfast, Dundalk, and we ended up in the Liberty Hall Theatre in Dublin. And we got great reviews everywhere. And most of the nights, some of the people in the audience was crying because, and when we seen them crying, we were delighted. In a way, we were delighted because we had got our message across, and we'd done it in a very strong way and meaningful and believable. This is the thing. We weren't actors. we were ourselves trying to get the message across to a wider audience. People that never tell us the troubles in Northern Ireland, especially up around Dublin and even in some parts of Belfast, they never knew things went on in White Cross where I live. You know, people never tell White Cross and people say near King's Mills over here a bit, you know, and this types of things. So it's a major part, and I was one of the instructors in trying to do that. And we get great news, and I suppose I could talk here all night about this here, but I'm very passionate about it, and I'm sure you can see that in me. I think my son now, he's good at the talking about himself. So we go on. A little honest on, I never slept a wink thinking about this year, and that's the way I am at all these shows and festivals that I go to, and elective storytelling and poetry and all these things. And I just thought of this anyway, and life is like shoelaces. Number one, you tighten up and pull together. Number two, you loosen up and enjoy. And number three, you open up and talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, and so glad that you're sharing part of your story, how important that is. And it takes a lot of courage. And hopefully we will chat a little bit more about that afterwards. So thank you. So now we're going to move on and hear from Frederique on her work at Theatre and Reconciliation in Belgium. Frederique.
Good evening, everybody. I'm a play director. I'm How to Remember War. I'm working not to remember war, but during the war in conflict zone and post-conflict zone in Congo, DRC Congo, Burundi, and sometimes in Rwanda. I'm working with non-actors and sometimes actors who are in the conflict: child soldier, victim of torture, perpetrator, prisoners, refugees, displaced people. And with all those people, I try to put people in conflict together. For example, the most exotic things I did is to put perpetrator and victim of torture together, or a child soldier with a young girl victim of rape. With all those people, I'm directing a play built with improvisation, and only improvisation about the conflict and their daily life and their life, what they want to do. I didn't ask, I have no idea before beginning directing a play. All the rehearsals take place in open place, never in a theater, and when we are performing, it's always on the open space, and front of a very huge audience, about 2,000, 3,000 people, and during the conflict. Then it's very sometimes scary, dangerous, touchy to put things on stage where the people are not agree. Then during the rehearsals, we have to be agree all together to take the risk to make a scene or make a play about the conflict. And then the discussion we have with all the actors is to be aware that we are in open space. A lot of people are watching the performance. It could be dangerous. And then we have to manage the scene. We have to understand each other, listen to each other. Of course, some scenes are funny, and sometimes some scenes are very cathartic. and the effect the rehearsals are doing to the actors is, of course, therapeutic effects, of course, sometimes reconciliation effect. Also, sometimes the performance is like a grave, a symbolic grave, because a lot of people, millions of people that are dead, and a lot of them were not buried. Then putting on stage symbolize all those dead people forgot in the society is very important to the people who are still alive. Then you can see just a little teaser about my work with child soldier. It's in French, but anyway, you can see some picture.
On a tendance à penser que les enfants soldats sont des enfants qui sont perdus pour la société, qui sont extrêmement violents, qui n'ont plus de notion de bien, de mal, qui ont perdu leur humanité. Moi, je vois pas ça du tout.
Minangaika masana, minangaika, sina wakunisomesha. Sina kunipa makunyo, anakosa wakunisaidia. Wanasemanga ya kwamba mie niko chini kovengo.
Théâtre et Réconciliation Bukavu le 18 juillet 2013. Je leur demande comment ils sont entrés dans les groupes armés, s'ils ont été enrôlés de force. Le petit dit qu'il a tué quelqu'un et qu'il a été envoyé dans les forces armées. Il pleure. Là, je commets une grave erreur. Un animateur du BVS m'interrompt, me disant qu'il ne faut pas parler de cela, et malheureusement je l'écoute. C'est comme si j'avais abandonné le petit avec son crime. Il aurait absolument fallu en faire une scène. Puisqu'il avait parlé ouvertement, il y a une obligation de ne pas laisser tomber, de théâtraliser, de prendre une distance sur ce qu'il venait de nous raconter. La difficulté, c'est que ce genre de témoignage fait peur. On a envie de se cacher la tête dans le sable. C'est à ce moment qu'il faut réagir, mais on n'a pas toujours le courage, ni la présence d'esprit. Je m'en veux absolument. Ce petit garçon pourrait être mon fils.
Mudunia yangu, kila mtu ana haki ya kutetelewa. Katika dunia yangu ya mpya, kila mtu iko na haki ya kutetewa. Mudunia yangu, kila mwanadamu ana haki ya kutumika. Dunia yangu, kama kusoma tukasoma, ni haki yako.
Nikaishi kule mpori mkirebere tititi, nikaishi sana. Nikaenda pambana vita yangu ya kwanza. Nikanyanganya bunduki 6. Mimi kunyanganya bunduki 6. Wakanipatia grati kule mkisota. Haitoshi, tukaendelea sasa, wakaniandikisha kwa vya mateatre na nikaona teatre kabisa inanistahili, na mpaka hivi mimi niko naona sana neza onda ngina kundi tu hata mkartie ngine fasi niko na wafundisha.
Allez, votez!
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Frederick. We hear about international conflict, and yet we have no idea what happens so many times at the grassroots. So hopefully we'll pick that up again in the discussion. Thank you for sharing. Um, Finally, we're going to hear from Fiona Bond Thompson, who will speak about working with Smashing Times as a professional artist and her involvement in the Creative Connections project and the film Tell Them Our Names. Tell Them Our Names is a film directed by Mary Moynihan. The film is an imagined recreation of moments from the lives of 5 powerful women during World War II, recalling moments of bravery, sacrifice, and love amidst the horror of war, as women stood up against fascism and totalitarianism and refused to accept oppression. So you're going to see a scene, and this is about, it's been inspired by the Spanish revolutionary leader, political activist, communist, and crusader against fascism, and that Dolores Ibarruri, who was involved in the Spanish Civil War and features Margaret Toomey, Ella Moynihan Brady, Fiona Bond Thompson, and Romana Testacasera. The film is directed by Mary Moynihan, scripted by Paul Kennedy, Mary Moynihan, and Fiona Bond Thompson, from a devising process with the cast, and produced by Smashing Times. And I do apologise if I've got some of those names wrong.
A Russian astronomer named an asteroid after me, asteroid Dolores. It's still out there, spinning madly around in space like myself, a bundle of energy and movement.
I'm 8 years old. The miners are on strike. The soldiers confront them pointing their guns.
And the women face the soldiers down. I look into the eyes of a soldier. He is scared. I listen to the women. Don't shoot us, they say. We have a right to strike. They speak passionately about the poverty they endure. And one by one, the soldiers withdraw. Something of that moment changes my life forever. I watch 4 of my children die because we are poor. I rarely speak of this, but inside I weep, my heart torn with grief. I survive, but I must do something. I read, attend meetings and rallies. I fight for change. I stand for election and win. Women can make a difference. I have 2 remaining children. I want to keep you with me, but how can I raise a child by dragging you through the streets, putting you in danger? So I send you away. I did it to make you happy, so you would enjoy a normal life. It crushed me to see you go, but I knew you would be safe. There is no sacrifice I would not make. I write for a communist newspaper. When they ask what name I am to use, I say La Passionaria. But that signifies a woman. Choose another name, they say, but I hold fast. I am strong, focused, relentless, ruthless. I walk the path to the end. That is the only way I know. That is my soul. I am La Passionaria. A woman denied the right to work is a slave. Earn your independence. Fight with your hearts and minds for justice. We are all free and equal. During the war, men and women fought bravely side by side. There is no distinction. I never feel unequal. I speak. My voice deep and booming. Words pour out of me. I am brave, my will like steel. I exalt in my strength. I am La Passionaria. I speak out. They shall not pass. I speak. I am not silent. I speak.
Hiya. So my name's Fiona Bond Thompson, and I'm an actor. I'm a writer and facilitator for Smashing Times Theatre Company. I've worked collaboratively with Smashing Times for many years, and in 2015 we worked on bringing together stories of women through history and war, and selecting some of these stories then to develop further creatively. It was quite a difficult process doing that, because obviously we had so many stories, and it was just a matter of trying to select which ones we thought would work best on stage or for film. Obviously every single story had really good significance. We used the process to delve further into the artistic possibilities on stage and on screen. Out of this, we created the film Tell Them Our Names, a snippet of what you've seen there now. So there was lots of monologues and lots of really powerful women that we showed on stage, and well, for the film. From that film, then we went on to develop further a stage play called Tell Them Our Names, and that play then took elements of the film, and it also brought in further women's stories, and we developed those further in rehearsals and through different script writing processes to come up with the stories that would do these strong women justice. What we did then after that was myself and someone called Stephen Heron. He's a professor at Queen's University in Belfast, Dr. Stephen Heron, and we together delivered some projects, some workshops with groups across the province. So we worked with ex-paramilitary groups, we worked with ex-soldiers, we worked with youth groups both here and in the southern border counties, GAA clubs and women's groups. And this was on the Creative Connections project. And from the Creative Connections project, we took on some of the stories from the film and from the stage play that went beforehand. And what we did to deliver these workshops was I performed 3 monologues from these groups, from these stories, and then we used that as a catalyst to promote discussion within the groups. And I'm just going to go over a very, very brief synopsis of some of the themes behind the monologues. So the first monologue that we portrayed was a monologue by a strong Spanish lady called Neus Capella Payeja, and she was from Tarragona in Catalonia. And Neus came from a poor family, and they couldn't educate her, so they sent the males off to be educated, and Neus wasn't educated, so she had to go and fund it herself. She went off to Barcelona and she trained herself to become a nurse. She joined the Socialist Party, and then at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, she was faced then with Franco and the fascists that came up and tried to take over. So she had an orphanage of 192 children, and she fled across the Pyrenees mountains with all these children in tow. When she got to France, she was met with the Nazis, not directly, but the Nazis had taken over France at that time. She made sure that the children were all placed with families, and then she joined the French resistance. Herself and her then husband, who she met through the French resistance, then continued to fight for the French resistance until they got captured, and she never seen her husband again. She was moved then to a concentration camp where she was went through some really horrific experiences, and this was one of the toughest parts of doing this, was the graphic images, the graphic nature of the stories of women within the concentration camps, and the things that the soldiers did to the women, to the young girls, to the babies. And she still remained strong in there. She wanted to die, but she found the strength to live, because she found it in herself that she wanted to tell people about the stories, about the things, the atrocities that had happened in these concentration camps, and she really wanted to get out and to tell the world what had happened. So she did. When she got to the concentration camps, then she she got to tell all these stories, and she lived until a few years ago. Actually, she was 105, I think, whenever she died. I might be wrong, but she was still alive at the time whenever I was first doing this monologue. So it was a real privilege to deliver these real life women, one of which who was still with us and still going strong. And so that was the first monologue. The second one was a Polish lady called Maria Eugenia Shińska, and she forged passports and got people out of the country. She got captured, she got severely tortured, and wouldn't disclose any information about anyone. And as a result, then she was sentenced to death by hanging, and her body was never found. We find this story really profound to tell because, she doesn't even have a headstone. So, and her life was so significant, the amount of people and the amount of lives that she saved. The next monologue that I brought into these groups was that of Martha Hillers, and she was a German lady from Berlin. And when the war was over, the same Russian soldiers that had freed Neus Katala from the concentration camps, had went into Berlin and had mass raped all the women in Berlin. The men were still at war, and they had no men there to protect them or to keep them safe. So they were mass raped. And after the war, when the war was over, the women were told to be quiet. So they weren't allowed to talk about it because there was a shame. There was some kind of a shame because the men hadn't been there to protect them. So Martha Hillers wrote this book, and she was ostracized for writing this book, for getting her information out there. And even though it was by anonymous, they still figured out it was her. But the fact that the women couldn't talk and weren't allowed to talk was a big thing. Not that this horrendous thing had happened to them, it was the fact, don't talk because you'll make us ashamed because we weren't here to protect you. So these were three of the stories that we brought in to the groups, the various groups, to prompt discussion on different things that had happened here, because although these stories were related to women in World War II, they're still very relevant to post-conflict and post-war in our own society. Martha Hiller's lines, she said, when the war is over, there was a silencing of voices, and that is completely prevalent to what's happened here. We would say, whatever you say nothing. Don't talk because it'll get you in trouble. So it's very, very relatable, and people could really relate to it. Even the likes of the groups and the women could say, yes, we done this, and no one ever cared about the women. We were here and we done this. No one knew what we were going through, because it was all to do with the men and what was happening out there. So the performances provided the catalyst for discussion. There was groups then that, after they had seen these really, really deep and personal stories of individuals that actually existed, when they seen their stories portrayed on stage or on the floor or community centre or wherever it was that we were doing it, they were able to open up a little bit more and talk about their experience, whether it be firsthand or through something that they had encountered or went through. So also the whole thing of talking, of not being able to talk, and the trust. So there was a whole thing too, and it's the same in Northern Ireland. Anyone from here would, if you're speaking to someone after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you kind of know who they are and where they're from. And this is really prevalent in the groups too. A couple of the groups are going, where are you from then? And it was just that thing of, I'll talk to you, but I need to know exactly who you are and where you're from. It didn't bother me at all, because I'm used to that. But a lot of stuff that came up within the groups as well was that the trust issues doesn't even go to the other side now. It's not like, well, you can't trust them and over there. There seems to be that circle seems to have tightened a little bit, in terms of people nearly are afraid to talk about their own people now, because there's certain levels of you can't say that, or there's different breakaway things that happens within their own communities on both sides. So this really came up as well within the groups, which was really, really, really interesting. And also, my generation will have experienced this firsthand. I've experienced bombs, I've experienced the aftermath of bombs, I've experienced the aftermath of shootings and the blood and everything else. I've seen all that firsthand myself, and the generations above me will have known that too. The younger generations don't know this. The younger generations will maybe see war as something that's glorious, victorious. Remember the dead, honor the dead, our soldiers, and war seems to be very much glorified. It's right up there, but the grim reality doesn't really sit with them. They don't know the lasting trauma and impact that this has on the individual, and the likes of these stories would really bring that home. And I just wanted to finish this off by something that Paul had said. If you had seen what I had seen, you'd never go to war. And that's just something that I want to finish off with.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Fiona. It's very interesting how you chose 5 women from World War II as well, and how that was relatable to the women in the more recent groups that you were running. So we can revisit that again. So thank you so much. Now we're going to look at maybe some questions for the speakers, and then maybe go into some open discussion. So suppose, Elaine, can I put you in the hot seat first? I know some of your work, and I practically live next door to the Playhouse. I work there. And I suppose for me, and hearing some of the work that you do with people who have been directly impacted by the Troubles, how do you look after them? I mean, they're going through traumatic experiences. How do you support and look after them, given that they might be triggering trauma in themselves again? So what are the practical things that you have to take care of, as well as getting everything else ready for production?
I think, Maureen, brilliant question. So I guess through experience, trying to create a safe space, that's primarily what we do. And I guess whenever I begin to drill into that means creating a safe space. So the director and the artists that we work with will create a safe space for people from opposing backgrounds with opposing views to come together. Sometimes there's heated conversations and tensions, and we build ways to address that. Secondly, providing support, therapeutic, counselling, psychological support, that both the participants, all of the team that are working with us can avail of. I think other important parts of our work, in terms of creating that safe space, is that people come to us and share their lived experiences, their testimonies. They share with us the most difficult, complex moments of their life. So it's very important for me personally that people engaging in our process always know that there's a way. If they want to move out of the process, if they want to take something out, if they've told part of their story and at one point they feel safe to do so, and at another point they reflect and think, oh, maybe I don't want to tell that to the public, that they, along that process, have editorial rights, that before production or before a piece of artwork is finished and created, that there's a way that they can pull that back. So creating a very safe space that people feel secure and are happy with, and being open about that from the beginning.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, at the play, Anything Can Happen, and I actually witnessed the way in which they not only drew support with each other, but a lot of them came to you, and it was just to look for reassurance, or you became a very good confidant or friend, and that's such an important thing.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, with the work that we do, it's about creating personal relationships, and everybody I'm always very honoured to work with the people we work with, because they come to us and they share those complex moments, and they build relationships with me and with all of the team, and I hope that they feel supported and cared for. And I think many of them, or most of them, become good friends and people that I personally would care a lot about.
Yeah, and it is so important that you look after yourself as well, because you get so emotionally invested in the whole process as well. So thank you, Elaine. Fergus, you talked about your work as a documentary filmmaker, and I actually worked with David Bolton many years ago, so it was lovely to see him there. And I'm aware of the trauma and some of the lived experiences that he went through. You talked about truth recovery, and you also talked about the challenge. How do I tell their stories? How do I do justice to their stories? And how do I humanize people, and just the power of those very words. I suppose for me, what you're doing is you're putting down very, very important historical memories, social history. And it has to be articulated in a way that people in future generations get to know the truth recovery, the truth of what has happened. But the difficulty is how do you choose what to put in and what to exclude? Because you'll have a limited amount of time. So how do you make those very, very difficult choices?
I mean, those are the challenges that face every working journalist and every artist and storyteller. What do you choose to tell? What do you choose to leave out? I mean, I was fascinated listening to John Reevy talking about, a 15-minute short film. And I can only imagine the blood, sweat, and tears that went into that production. And now he's editing a film, and he maybe has an hour of footage or more, and he'll try to edit that into 15 minutes into a narrative that actually an audience can view. The big challenge in The Quiet Shuffling of Feet was, how do I tell this story that's a victim story without actually hurting victims? And there were a number of challenges that I faced and that I made editorial decisions on. The first one was, I made an editorial decision I would not use newsreel footage. There was a lot of newsreel footage available for the Enniskillen bombing and the aftermath of the Omagh bombing, and I decided not to do that. Instead, I felt that the challenge was to try and tell a very human and very personal story, and to try and do that both in the real time and then to reflect how the community responded. So I spent a lot of time in newspaper archives, and when it came to choosing the images that went alongside some of the very difficult statements that David was making and recalling the events, particularly around the Omagh bombing, before the news was broken to the individuals that they'd lost their son, their daughter, etc. What images do you want to show that? So I tried to avoid using, images that were of bodies, of devastation, and so on. And instead, I chose images that were about artwork, that were about reconciliation. You saw in the archive the boxes and boxes of sympathy cards. You saw the images of the memorial glass, and we were just very fortunate on the day we were filming, it started to rain, and we followed that image of the trickling down, etc., which seemed to match up then to the horror of the story that we were telling. But I suppose the final challenge I have to say is I'm 63 years old, and I lived through the conflict, and my family lived through that conflict. And I witnessed a lot, I experienced a lot, and one of the biggest challenges I had was not to allow my own personal experience and what I knew and the images and the hurt and the pain that myself and my family suffered to infect David's story, because I felt that's the challenge. We're only there as facilitators. It's our pen, it's our choreography, it's our filmmaking that enables to tell somebody else's story, not my story. The editorial decisions I have control over, but ultimately I wanted to be as true to David's story and to remembering respectfully all those who died or were injured, and to tell their very, very difficult recovery journey, and to finish in a very hopeful way that it is possible to recover and to move beyond the immediate trauma, and living within that liminal state for years.
Well, thank you so much, Fergus. And it is hard. Many of the people we work with, they bring their story, but they also bring their baggage. So to be able to look at truth recovery and not bring your own story into it is a very difficult thing to do. So appreciate that feedback from you, because it's a huge challenge. And if we're trying to record in a way that we're trying to give an overall or a rounded picture, it is important into the future so that we don't re-traumatize, but also that we try to remove sectarianism, that we try to get people to think differently, to think of the bigger picture. So thank you. So John, you're a young pup. I mean, 22 years of age. Your daddy must be very proud of you. But, as I said earlier on, you're very mature, because you talked about trying to be unbiased, just what Fergus was talking about there, trying to be unbiased, trying to give a full story. You said, to tell the story fully. So how did the family members that you were talking to, how did they react? I mean, you're young. Did they take you really seriously? How did the relationships change or shift? And also, I'm really interested about, how did your peers feel about what you were doing? Is it something that you would have had a drink in the pub chatting about, this is what I'm doing? How did your peers react to what you're doing? So your family and then your peers.
No worries. Yeah, no. Thanks for the lovely words, by the way. It's really interesting to hear Fergus say, kind of how, not letting your own experience define how you approach the story, because it was something super similar to me. So of course, like, the harsh reality of doing a story like this is that, like, it's really sensitive to a lot of people, and like, at the end, I'm talking about the story, it's like my three uncles were murdered, and that was something that, there's so much feelings attached to it. Like, I've grown up my whole life hearing this story so many times, from so many different people, and it's just always been this thing that I've lived with, and kind of always knew it was going to be a big deal, and that eventually I would want to tell a story. So I knew this would be the right time. So when eventually it did come to the pre-production for it and coming and speaking to my family about it, I think they were really, like, proud to see I was doing something like that. But also, it's one of those topics where some people are super comfortable talking about it, and have definitely got a bit more of a grasp around it, whereas others, were quite reserved. Like, they would rather keep a lot in them, and you know what, kind of getting that research, you have to understand that. So it was definitely an interesting experience, but nothing beats the family, the people who grew up with these lads, the people who knew them the best. In terms of my peers, like, it definitely was something that a lot of people were shocked by, because when I'm saying to somebody I'm making a short film, they're expecting, oh, have you made up a little story? Have you made up something funny or whatever? But no, like, definitely something that, is a lot more serious, and a lot more home hitting. And I want to make an impact with this film. It's not something I'm making just, to entertain. It's definitely something I want a message portrayed across. I want people to watch this and take something from it. And so by telling, my peers, my friends, that, I definitely think they were a little surprised, and a lot of people were saying, "God, this is a massive story." Like the pressure was definitely on me at the beginning to impress and to have a solid structure. So had to do all my best, and thanks to an absolutely fantastic team on board. Like, I never ever felt like I couldn't do it, because the support I got from all the family and all my friends who just knew I was the right man for the job, just kept motivating me, and I'm honestly absolutely buzzing to get cracking on with it, and yeah, super happy.
That's lovely. And you could have ended up, instead of being the person that you are and trying to share that story, you could have ended up quite bitter. Here's three uncles murdered, and you took a different road, and it's lovely to see, that's such a model for other people as well. So thank you so much, John. So Paul, I'm going to put you in the hot seat now. You talked about, you wanted to warn people that war is a horrible thing, and you talked about, you know, you had some reservations at one time in telling your story, but you also talked that you had demons for a long time. and that was really difficult for you. Uh, you see, whenever you did the blood red lines, did it enable you to let some of those demons go? And was that influenced by the fact that you heard many other stories as well? And was it, can I say, was it good for you to be able to do that, to let go of some of those demons that you talked about?
Well, I suppose I nearly ready to go back to the start of that, but it's when I joined Blood Lades, I was sort of duped into it by my brother by proxy, and I saw it as an ordinary acting job, which suited me. And then when I got there and I was to tell this story, I was quite shocked, and I didn't go back for a couple of sessions. And then the director and a few other people came out to see me and spoke to me, and I got back in again, and I got. Then when we got round the huddle, as they call it, and talking to the rest of the members of the cast, and it was only then when I took home the scripts and read their stories at night. My God, I says I have to tell mine, and I had those demons, and it was. I don't know if I knew it was going to be released for to get them out, but I knew it was a facilitator that could let me release some of them, if not them all. But to share it with the other people and to get up on the stage, not only to the cast, that probably got to be that was a hard enough time. But then to do it in front of all the people and my friends where I live, none of them knew really all the bits and pieces of the story. They knew everybody knows about the story, but you can. It's a small print, the things that I have to say in my head, and once I got those out and shared them, it was quite a relief. Yes, I can say it was a lot of relief. Yes.
Yeah. And it's powerful the way you say, it was only, part of a story. And most of us only know half the story anyway. So to be able to lay that out and to think that through and to be able to tell the whole story means that people that probably know you very, very well are finding out a lot about you that they may never have known before because you'd never shared all of that story.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, yeah. And when I would meet people out after, they would say, God, I don't know how you done that there and all, and they knew, most of my friends knew I was an actor anyway, but this was true to life, and I think they were quite shocked as well, because when I'm out, like I am, when I'm at home, I'm introvert, and when I'm out, I'm extrovert. That's the talking, and I do storytelling and poetry, and this is all escapism. You know what I mean? And then I retreat back to the house and close the door, and I'm a different person then again. And I relate back and forward to this here most of my life. And it's just my way of dealing with things, and even to this day, I'll still. Behave like that, and it's my way of coping, and then the drama it takes me back out of that again, and if I'm going to a show or anything, it's a release, and drama has been my life, and it's my way of escaping out of the real world to the fantasy world. But Blood Red Lines was a mixture of both, and it was scary and real life, but I learned to cope with it, and I thank everybody at Blood Red Lines for that, and Elaine Ford was a great help as well, so thank you for that, Elaine.
And it's lovely when you put that, they say when you put the story out there, it loses the power over you. You externalize it so it loses some of its power, and hopefully it gives some of that release. I suppose next, Frederick. So thank you, Paul. Frederick, you talked about some of the international conflict zones. You talked about victims of torture. You talked about child soldiers. and that you would put these protagonists and victims together. And it was about taking huge risks and often very, very dangerous. So I suppose I want to ask, how did you look after yourself given it was so dangerous? And then how did you encourage people to participate? Because given the dangers, they may have put themselves into danger or they may have been afraid to come forward. So how did you manage to engage people to do the work, to do the drama, to do the performances?
I put a safe space where the actors are confident to share their story. It's a confident relationship. They share their testimony, they share their lives, and they believe when it's important for them to speak about. But the first sight, they are shy, they don't want to speak, they don't want to remember all those tough stories. But after 1 day or 2 day being together, making warm up, laughing, and it relaxes the people, and then they understand the importance to share their story, not only for themselves, it's important for themselves, but also for the audience. Then I never forget that there will be an audience. It's dangerous, not exact. It's difficult to say because it's, if I say no, it's not dangerous, it seems I am an hero. And if I say no, yes, it's dangerous, I'm also a hero. That I can't answer this question. But I'm supported by some people who are native from there, who knows a lot about the history of Burundi and DRC and Rwanda, and they told me, well, in that direction you can't go because it's too dangerous. Though I'm not alone, and of course, because of the censorship about the state, for example, in Rwanda there is a lot of censorship. Then I'm in a way I'm protected by the censorship, that I'm sure not to go too far in the things I'm going to reveal.
And was there any particular conflict zone where you had to withdraw, where it just became too dangerous? Is there one that stands out for you that was particularly difficult?
For me personally, the problem is not me. It's not my life, it's not my conflict, it's not my war, it's not my story, it's not my trauma. I'm there as a play director. And as a play director, what can I do to make something with all those testimony? And it's that position which builds me and which builds the actors also. Then I don't have any psychologist around me and so on. I think it's not necessary. In my way of working, it's not necessary at all. Only the way to build a scene after some improvisation that the actors share with me, I oblige myself to do something on a scene with this testimony, and it brings me confidence only with the tools of theater, and also it brings confidence to the actors also. Then for me, the tool and the powerful of theater, it's enough to build something about war.
Lovely. Okay, thank you so much, Frederick. I suppose just hearing a little bit about different conflict zones, and just even the cultural sensitivities and particularly the oppression of women. It's often very hard to have those voices in particular brought forward, which lets me move on to Fiona. Fiona, it's interesting that you chose World War II. And I was thinking, it has been so hard. We did a lot of work with the in the decade of anniversaries on World War One. It was very, very hard to get women's voices because they'd been written out of history. And there's been a long, hard slog to actually recover those women's voices. And I heard you talk about somebody wrote a book and then somebody else told a bit of a story. How difficult, though, was it to get the research, the in-depth research that you would have needed to give those stories, to give a rounded story? And did you have to take liberty or license to create part of the stories yourself with these women? Why World War II and recovering those voices?
I mean, there was loads of different women and different like snippets of stories that we came across, and one in particular that I didn't discuss there was Mary Elms, and Mary Elms is a lady from Cork who done fantastic things in World War II, went across and saved so many lives. Through World War II, sacrificing her own life, not sacrificing, putting her own life at risk by taking so many children out of these holding camps in the boot of her car up to the mountains and to safe holdings. And that's what one voice that I didn't. That's the part that I played in the film whenever we had first done the film, and her story is absolutely remarkable, and more so probably the most remarkable part of it for me, because we were so used to going through all these absolutely amazing things that women had done, that by the time you come to the 20th story you're going, oh wow, here's another great woman that obviously no one else had ever heard anything about, because in war times you very much get that whole, you see the line of men with their medals after wartime. That's kind of, it's a very stereotypical image, but there's very little recognition for women. And there's the women are, and probably just like the women run a whole lot of things and very often go unrecognized. And I don't know whether that's because they maybe don't seek recognition. I don't know, but Mary Elms, for example, had went off after the war and settled down, had a family, and didn't really speak much of it. And it was only that a Jewish professor or doctor had came across to Ireland from America, seeking this woman, searching for this woman who had saved his life. And he had discovered that she had recently died, I think a few years earlier. And he discovered so many more children, obviously, that had grown up at this stage that had been saved by Mary Elms. And her story was so remarkable, but yet she lived such a humble life after the war. She done such remarkable things for other people and didn't seek any recognition for it. So these are the kind of stories that we had came across and went, it's very humbling. Even the likes of Neus, in her times in the concentration camps, she had she was sent to an ammunition factory to create ammunition, obviously, but she had produced faulty bullets. She had discovered some way to produce bullets that didn't work. So obviously there's a chance that she could get caught, but she persevered and she kept doing this. So um the the women's stories are there, but it's just a matter of finding them. Neus was still alive, fortunately, whenever we were doing all this research. So we were able to have direct contact as well with ones that knew a lot about her. And I think whenever someone had went over to visit her, um, in 2000, maybe it was 2016, she was in a residential home, I think, and she was still reading the political column of the local newspaper. So she was still very much interested in politics and going on. And um, as I say, it's just there's so many stories, but then again, we did have to dramatize in between the lines sometimes, because the likes of Maria Eugenia Shinska, there's very little on her because of
Yeah.
the circumstances.
Yeah. And some of the work we did too, we were challenged and said, you can't take license because that's not the truth. And if the truth is not there, you have to actually try to be, take that calculated risk about this is what it probably was like. Just very quickly, because I'm feeling very as if I'm enjoying myself and being very indulgent, being able to ask these questions. What was the biggest message that the women and the women's groups took away from the workshops? What was the most relatable thing that they were able to relate to that they could take away in their lives?
I think it's just that empowerment. I think it's that a lot of women just on a normal level, um, we don't take enough credit for the things that we do. And whether that's just behind the scenes, underground, running things in the house or running things in the community, the men are much more prevalent in everything that they do. And I think a lot of the women kind of thought, oh, we are great and there are things that you do that you can seek recognition for, um but yeah, just being able to hear that these remarkable stories are there, that they're told, that war doesn't just affect the men. War isn't just about the soldiers in the front line. It's not about the ones holding the guns or the ones being fired at, which obviously are often women as well. But there's someone behind the scenes running the show, and a lot of the times the women could really relate to that, especially in the women's groups.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just saying, there's lots of amazing comments coming up and feedback. So I'm afraid I'm not able to read it all. And a couple of questions came up, but I was so busy asking you other questions. I suppose just for anyone on the panel now, this is such important work. And it comes with its own risks, and appreciate there's always a struggle with regards to resources. So if you were going to tell anybody about doing this work, what is the biggest message that this is to anyone on the panel, what's the most important thing that you could tell somebody who would be interested in doing this work? What's the most important message? So just open to any of the panelists. Yes, Fergus.
I think for
And then John.
me, it has to be perseverance. Before I got involved in filmmaking, I had other careers, and I actually I've led 4 children's charities in Northern Ireland, and at one time I led a fantastic organisation called Children's Express. It's an organisation does a program of learning through journalism, and it's now called Headliners. And I had the privilege of establishing the first bureau in Derry, and it's still. I'm glad to see it's still running strong. And it recruited in Belfast. The Belfast project recruited a very young, energetic young lady, 14 years old, called Lara McKee, and she cut her first teeth in the Headliners project. And what stays with me is the perseverance. I introduced documentary filmmaking into the Belfast Bureau, and when I saw what 14 to 16-year-olds could do with a film camera, I kind of thought, do you know what? I'd love to have a go at that. And I left it very late in life to actually take the courage to, leave a very well paid job and to have a shot at this. And I managed to persuade David Bolton, much against his will, to be the first subject of the film. And I did apply for money for a grant. I didn't get any money, etc. I simply ploughed my own savings into doing it because I believe so strongly in the story, and I wanted that story to be told. And along the journey, you have enormous doubts. Are you doing the right thing? Will it ever materialize into anything that anybody else will want to watch? And I remember on the night of the premiere in Enniskillen, and there were large numbers of victims and survivors of the Enniskillen bombing there. I literally was sat in my seat in fear and trembling. You're sitting in an audience of 300 people. What are they going to make of 2 years of work? And when the film ended, and I was being invited down with David Bolton to take part in the question and answers, I actually just broke down. I was in tears. And I suppose it was part about that struggle to actually get the story made, to actually make the film. And as I got up to leave my seat and shuffle along, I stopped to compose myself. And when I looked down, the person whose eyes I was looking down into was Joan Wilson, who was the mother of Mary Wilson, who died in the Enniskillen bombing. And she could see I was quite distressed. And she pulled me down by my elbow and whispered into my ear, and she said, "Fergus, it'll be all right." And she was perfectly right. Once I got on stage and was composed again, I could answer the questions. But I think that's the single most important lesson is the perseverance, the conviction to see the project through to completion.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Fergus. I think there's somebody with a question there. Yeah. Yes, the question has come up. Sorry, John, just after we asked this question, then because you had your hand up, but thank you to all for your important work in looking at the human cost, impact, and ripples of war. How do you mind yourselves in researching and bringing these stories to life? And that's from Geraldine McAlinden. And that can be anybody in the panel who wants to answer that. How do you mind yourselves in researching and bringing these stories to life?
I think she might have meant how do we find ourselves? I think it must be like a spelling mistake. How do we find ourselves?
Okay.
Unless I just adopted it wrong.
Okay.
Maybe just about how to remind ourselves, how do we look after our own well-being while researching these.
True.
Maybe what she means.
Yeah, I think she
Yeah.
definitely around self-care and how I guess many of us working in this area will hear stories and experiences from people who have been impacted by bombs, explosions, killing, death, very complex experiences, and they share their story with us. And many of us have been impacted ourselves. And I think there's something in terms of definitely within my role and with those that I work for, trying to, and I mentioned it earlier about creating that sort of framework or that safe space that we have support. And I think there's psychological support, but there's also that this just the self care of yourself. And over the past 3 years, I've worked with many victims and survivors of the Northern Ireland conflict who have shared horrific stories. And I know that for me, fresh air, eating well, sleeping, all of those things are really important to me. And especially whenever you're listening and hearing and being moved by stories and by people's courage and bravery, at the same time as putting on a production and ensuring that we're within budget and we're able to do all of the things that we need and want to do, and that it's marketed and audiences are coming, and dealing with funders, that just that kind of self-care of myself and making sure that I have all of those sort of practices in place of being with friends or being in the fresh air. So.
Yeah. Thank you. John, you were going to pick up there, so thank you for that response, Elaine. John, you were going to pick up there and say something.
I actually wasn't. I was actually, the camera's like reversed. I was trying to point this direction because it was answered phenomenally, so I've nothing to add, honestly.
No worries. And is there anybody else in the panel that would like any final words to say out there to some young budding artist or somebody who's really interested in doing this type of work? Any final words of advice? Elaine, it was important what you said about looking after yourself. There's vicarious trauma and secondary trauma that you can take on from those experiences. Frederick, you have your hand up.
Yes.
Frederick.
Yes, hello. If somebody wants to do this kind of job, you have to be courageous. You have to be also not gentle. You have to use all the tools you have to make arts. And that's all. And also,
Beautiful.
I think what's it's important is you have to believe on what you are doing. Then after it will be easy.
Lovely. Frederick, I think that those are lovely words to end this on. So, can I say a big, big thank you to all of our speakers for being a part of today's event, How We Remember War. And this is part of the Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival 2020, hosted by Smashing Times International Centre for the Arts and Equality. So, please do go on their website. And I'm sure there's going to be lots more of discussion of this type. But thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for having the courage and the bravery to do what you do. And we're all the better for it. So, from my heart, thank you. And just a privilege to be here and sharing and hearing from yourselves tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.